Is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a story of good versus evil, or fundamentally of good versus good?
That is the question.
Or at least it's the question with which I ended my last video. For 3 videos now, I've been talking up the idea of a good versus good conflict as a better lens for Israel and Palestine, repeatedly implying that I have a view on this without ever actually committing the scandalous act of stating it.
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question.
So, what about Palestine and Israel? Are we dealing with a collision of 2 goods here? And if so, what are these goods? Actually, it's the same good, nationalism. Whether nationalism itself deserves to be called good is another question entirely, and one I wrestle with. I've seen the best of what the nation-state can offer: human rights, relatively fair institutions, social contracts that actually function at least some of the time. But I've also seen what nationalism can devolve into: xenophobia, war, ethnic cleansing. 2 world wars come to mind rather quickly, not to mention the places, such as in vast swaths of Africa, where national borders were imposed with little to no regard for the actual people groups living there. But even if you're ambivalent about nationalism, or allergic to it entirely, as I sometimes find myself to be, you can't ignore the historical fact. From the late 18th to the mid-20th century, the world underwent a remarkable transformation. We carved up the globe into bordered, self-identifying entities called nation-states. And what's even more remarkable is that we treat this as natural, as if it were the only way to organize political life. The truth is, it's not natural at all. It's an idea, a powerful one, sure, but still just an idea. And yet, this idea became the only game in the global town. You can't cross most borders today without being authorized by some version of it. Try being stateless, like Nietzsche was for most of his life, and see how far you get. The days of drifting across frontiers with nothing but a walking stick and a feverish philosophy manuscript are gone.
Stand behind the O-line.
This global parceling into nation-states created immense pressures for people without one. In fact, one of the great ironies, or perhaps structural tragedies, of modern history is that nationalism, which once emerged as a liberating force against dynastic rule and imperial abstraction, quickly became a cage into which every people had to contort itself or risk being left without a chair when the music stopped. And in that game, no one gets to abstain. Nationalism isn't just a feeling or a flag. It's a political grammar that came to structure the very possibility of international recognition. A people without a nation-state is, under the prevailing logic of modernity, a people without political agency. Hence the terrible bind: to survive in the modern order, you must play the nationalist game. Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism, understood this. Witnessing the Dreyfus Affair, a political scandal in 1890s France, in which a Jewish army officer, Alfred Dreyfus, was wrongfully convicted of treason, exposing deep currents of anti-Semitism in French society, he understood that the Jews, a people long accustomed to being a minority, would be increasingly vulnerable in a world dominated by majority-rule nation-states. And history grimly proved him right. The Holocaust wasn't just a horror. It was a confirmation that the rules of the modern political game were unforgiving to those without a home field. Given that context, and given the deep historical and spiritual ties of Jews to the land of Israel, of course something like Zionism would emerge. The insistence that the Jewish people too must have a nation-state, or else be perpetually at the mercy of those who do. The tragedy is that this Jewish nationalism focused on a place where another people already lived. And yes, there were people living there, but it was people who, until then, had been somewhat insulated from the pressures of nationalism by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans, for all their flaws, ran a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire that didn't demand national identity from its subjects. To resist oversimplification, I should probably insert here that under European pressure, the late Ottoman Empire did try to move in a nationalistic direction, but the attempt inspired little mass loyalty and ultimately collapsed. You could be a Palestinian Arab and see yourself as part of a broader Arab culture, or as a loyal Ottoman subject, or as belonging to Greater Syria, or as a member of your village or tribe, or any combination thereof. But when the empire fell apart after World War I, the modern nationalist storm swept in. Arab nationalisms rose, often competing with one another, and European colonialism only added to the confusion, slicing up the Middle East with cartographic arrogance and a taste for proxy power. In that context, it's true that Zionism helped to crystallize Palestinian nationalism, but to say it was only a reaction is both historically crude and morally glib. In a world where nationalism had become the only recognized political currency, of course, the people having their homes in Palestine would eventually come to forge their own version. It took time, partly because of the legacy of empire, partly because of the weight of colonial interference. But that doesn't make it less real or less legitimate. Also, on that note, to question the legitimacy of Palestinian nationalism on the grounds of its reactive genesis is to forget or willfully ignore that almost all cohesive nationalisms are reactionary in some sense. Zionism is reactionary to diaspora, powerlessness, pogrom, Holocaust. Irish nationalism was reactionary to British rule, Indian nationalism to colonial domination, American nationalism to imperial taxation and perceived injustice. The list could go on. Nationalism is almost never born in the serene flowering of autonomous self-articulation. It arises in trauma, in opposition, in the desire not to disappear. Where this becomes particularly tragic in the deepest Greek sense of the term is when two nationalisms, with equally compelling historical claims and equally legitimate grievances, are structurally forced into collision. Because the logic of the nation-state demands bounded territory, exclusive sovereignty, and in the modern imagination, a one-to-one ratio between people and land. In this model, to share is to lose. To recognize the legitimacy of the other's claim is, in nationalist arithmetic, to undermine your own. And so here we are, two peoples, both forged by suffering, both historically linked to the same land, both shaped by the same 20th century tidal wave of nationalist expectation, and both caught in a zero-sum logic. They did not invent, but have inherited and internalized. And worse still, each side now has decades of pain, trauma, and blood to prove its moral claim. Each has folded history into identity and identity into destiny. And when identity becomes sacred, compromise becomes betrayal. What I'm trying to lay out here then is a kind of antidote to the false narratives of exclusivity, a reminder that the issue is not that one nationalism is more legitimate than the other, but that the modern world gave us nationalism as the only script for legitimacy. And in a land as layered as Israel-Palestine, where sacred geography, historical memory, and living populations all collide, that script turns from a story of dignity into a tragedy of mutual denial. So when I hear people trying to delegitimize either Jewish or Palestinian nationalism, I hear a refusal to reckon with the historical reality we've all inherited. That's not to say nationalism doesn't distort history. Benedict Anderson and others have shown how deeply it relies on myth-making. There's even that old quip that when creating a nation, one of the most crucial factors is to get your history wrong. And certainly some Israelis and Palestinians have, in the words of historian James L. Gelvin, done an absolutely magnificent job in getting their history wrong. But if nationalism is the game we've all been forced to play, then both sides of this conflict are equally entitled to play it, and tragically, to lose by it. This is the tragedy. This is the good versus good story. One nationalism versus another nationalism. Because in a world in which nationhood is the only legitimate currency a people is allowed to trade in, it is a good you cannot afford to be without.